I gave the title When Disavowal Goes Global. I don't exactly love it. It's not exactly what I'm going to talk about, but that was a year ago. We're going to try to talk about the ways that we avoid knowing about climate change and some ways that we may actually get through those obstacles to meaningful action rather than knowing but acting like we don't know. So first question to talk about is how can we get people to believe in climate change more? Yeah, it's been recognized for decades, and particularly in the last decade, that the problem with climate change is a problem with human behavior. It's been difficult to get people to believe in climate change despite the 97% consensus. So can we do anything about that? And the thought about this disbelief has been that if people understand it better, they'll care appropriately and support the necessary actions. Like the man holding the round earth, the idea was just to get the flat earthers' attention. This is called the gateway belief model. It starts with surveys that show that the US population underestimates the scientific consensus on climate change. And the goal is highlight the consensus, and then people will adopt these beliefs and change their behaviors in line with that knowledge. Unfortunately, it kind of didn't pan out. I recommended an article by Bays et al. From 2020 that goes into some detail about how complex conveying even this one basic message can be. There's so many ways that we can resist having the right information about climate change. The gateway belief model can backfire among people who feel manipulated or forced to adopt the consensus view and make them dig harder into their original beliefs, the backfire effect. The backfire effect isn't consistent, though, and even really subtle stuff like, do you know, scientists agree, can totally change the study outcomes. A desire to preserve personal freedom and self-esteem can play a role in refusing to adopt the consensus view, leading people to ignore information to maintain that their own opinions are right and that they can't be told what to think, the so-called self-serving and conservation biases, or refuse the information to preserve their allegiance to a group identity or conservative values, the so-called in-group biases. Or the easy false consensus bias, which is, I know everything and I'm always right. And so people refuse the information on that basis. And so Bays and all note that, it's really quite difficult just to get this one message across. And also that much of the research has been done in dominant groups, whereas more climate vulnerable populations may think entirely differently about this. The point is that even the most basic idea is hard to get across. How do we get it across? Well, there's been a lot of really good research done by groups like Eco-America, which is sort of a climate communications research group with a kind of marketing-oriented approach, and the Yale Program for Climate Communication and others. And the YPCC has classified people into these 6 groups. You may have seen this before. Those who are alarmed, concerned, cautiously concerned, disengaged, doubtful, and dismissive. And it does help to address those groups on their own terms. And those groups have held up across populations. How you speak to them determines how they respond. And there is a take-home point. You shouldn't even bother talking to the dismissive group because you won't get anywhere. And Eco-America has found a number of strategies for engaging people in a conversation about climate change. What you want to do is focus on observable local realities, talking to people in a visual language about their own experience, focusing on health of families and children, the benefits of climate action, being super positive about how good the solutions are these days. Don't talk to them about how many jobs will be created, but rather talk to them about how much they'll save, and talk about what we can do for future generations all together, getting away from the bad guys because we can be free of them in our actions. Right? So those are the kind of messaging things that have been shown to be helpful. And the most important thing, though, is to open your mouth and just talk about it. We do not talk about this. And this is actually one of the biggest problems. And remember, when you do this, that you're trying to get through to busy people, and that the human attention span is 3 sentences, 9 seconds, and 27 words. Okay, you don't have much time. So what might this look like? Here's 4 different groups that you might try to have a climate communication with. You might say to Muslim countries, as leaders of the energy economy, you could dominate other countries by a rapid transition to solar energy and survive the challenges of drought and heat for your people. You might say to number 2 there, solar panels can provide cooking heat for people living in poverty like you. Or the methane your cows are producing can be captured while your cows are feeding and milking and double your profits. Or climate change can reduce your payouts from the damage of climate action can reduce the payouts for damage from coastal storms. right? So those would be techniques for addressing people in their own language locally. But even with the best climate communications messaging, the most recent 2021 survey continues to document this really core problem, which is while most of America believes that climate change is happening, it'll harm future generations, it's harming people in developing countries, it's harming other people in the US, when it comes to thinking about has it harmed or will it harm me personally, there's this massive drop off in the statistic. The personal threat of global warming is consistently disavowed and displaced, happening much later to other people far, far away, right? So the question is, how can we talk about it more and bring it home? And why don't people apply this knowledge to themselves a little bit more? When Eco-America explored how people distance themselves from climate change, these are the common attitudes they found as ways to disengage. I don't believe the doom and gloom. There's nothing we can do. It doesn't matter to me. It won't happen soon. It doesn't apply to where I live. I have other concerns and other priorities about my health and finances now. It's God will. It's not my fault. Why me? Why should I be responsible? Only environmentalists care about climate change. It's not my group. Okay. So now I have a little clinical challenge for you guys. Here's a clinical exercise. Imagine you had a patient with cancer and the patient said, oh, it's not so bad. It won't get to me for a long time. I'm super busy right now. It doesn't matter. It's not up to me. It's up to the doctors and God. What would you do as a psychodynamics therapist to address this clinical situation? And if anybody wants to drop anything into the chat, I would be super, super grateful for that. What would you do with the cancer patient that was having those attitudes?
Give people a minute to respond either in the chat, or they could even just unmute themselves if they'd like to do that. One thing would be to help people think about what the implications would be for others if the cancer gets worse, if they die, in terms of children they have, parents they have, who they be leaving behind, to help them empathize with others and how their short-sighted behaviors would be disastrous for other people. And this also speaks to the idea that it's something that's sort of far away, and it's not going to affect me personally. One of the criteria for having a healthy, I'll say, superego, and just being able to think about the effect on other people, whether they're near or far or whatever. One evidence that is being able to do that. So it takes a more mature person. And in the first instance I mentioned, though, it's more in the here and now, not thinking of personality change, but just thinking about the impact of their choices on others.
Yeah. Okay. So I think there's a lot more to say, but just one way of looking at it. 12 years ago, a psychologist who was active in the American Psychological Association climate work named Robert Gifford wrote a paper about all the different resistances to climate action and what he called the dragons of inaction. And the first group of resistances he identified had to do with difficulties absorbing climate knowledge. He points out that we have this kind of ancient brain, which is to set up to take care of ourselves in our small group and not to preserve larger systems, and to respond in the immediate realm with immediate resource preservation. So all of that goes against preserving resources for the future and dealing with climate dangers, which are more diffuse. And the second resistance to knowledge that he identifies are the ways that we can be ignorant of climate change. So it's not only that we may not know about the problem, but we may not know what to do about the problem once we know about it. And we may not know what the relative benefits are of the things we could do once we know. So there's like various levels of ignorance, and it's really quite hard, right? Should you get a solar panel or should you buy an electric car? Which one is more economically smart in terms of carbon reduction? The answer is probably electric car, but it depends on the person. And then finally, we screen out awareness of climate change through what he calls environmental numbness. And what he means by that is either habituation to climate messages or the way we selectively neglect things that are not in our immediate environment. So I don't usually look at the weather forecast for various parts of the world that I have nothing to do with. I only pay attention to my environment. We also don't deal with climate change because of the uncertainty, right, in the information and the predictions, and that has been shown to be associated with less pro-environmental behavior. Yeah. We conserve our intellectual energy through shortcuts, which are called mental heuristics, and we tend to stay with things the way they are now and try to conform to what we already believe to simplify the complexity of things. And some of the heuristics that he felt were important in climate inaction are what he called what is called judgmental discounting, which is our tendency to undermine or undervalue future distant risks, even very short distant risks, as much as well, it'll happen to the other village, not my village. We tend to be too optimistic, like this avalanche guy, underestimating our own vulnerability. And we have a lot of trouble walking away from things that we've put a lot into, even if they're going poorly, such as the people who are in the boat who have stayed on their coastal vacation home on Miami Beach. And there's a study by Paul et al., which found that even environmental activists show excessive optimism in how they undervalue how likely environmental hazards are to affect them. I was stunned this year to learn that my own home has a 100% chance of burning, according to my insurance company, which is not the way I think of it. Okay? Other mental heuristics that make it hard to act on climate change are that we tend to avoid low yield action. So we don't want to try something new that might not work. We tend to wait on other people to start before we start, the bystander effect. And we tend to focus on how others should change before we start thinking about how we should change. And then we do things in a tokened and kind of rebound way. We put a little bit into it, we make a token gesture, or we do something in a period of austerity for a while, and then we go back to our sort of old ways. Gifford's third group, after these ignorance biases and cognitive biases, was climate resistance due to social pressures. These can be thought of as pressures to stay with the safe group on the one side, and pressures to avoid getting swept up in the new dangerous group on the other. He highlighted the way we want to be doing what we perceive to be normal and not stand out. And we are very prone to a so-called consensus trance and can be swayed into consensus action by powerful leaders or bad apples. So people that sow doubt or sow emotional controversy can lead us into consensus in dangerous ways, which is where climate denialism and Trump have obviously been so effective. We also tend to discredit or mistrust views which are unfamiliar and be skeptical or oppositional in order to maintain our views, as we said before. So as I think you all know, these biases have been exploited by people who don't want us to know about and react to climate change. There's been a massive campaign of disinformation and denial, and it continues to be waged by the fossil fuel community against adequate response. And this is despite the fact that right now, 70 to 80% of the American public would really like to see more climate action. The fossil fuel industry is known for 30 years what is happening, and they've done their best to turn our eyes away from it through the tools of disinformation and denial. These include the one bad apple heuristic by doing things like questioning the scientific evidence. They split social groups by introducing false experts with contradictory evidence, highlight false divisions of opinion in the scientific community, cherry pick facts, use logical fallacies or straw man arguments, or attack the person themselves, the ad hominem attacks. And every time there's been an advance in the climate movement, they've moved the goalposts to a new strategy, a new reason that climate action should be delayed. Now it's natural gas and the importance of that gradual transition. And with Trump, we saw frank fear-mongering about what can happen if we change our energy sources, and conspiracy theories that they were trying to weaken us from abroad. So there's this interesting theory about the way we put our heads in the sand. It's called terror management theory. I don't know, are people familiar with it? Terror management theory posits that we're formed biologically to have sort of two competing instincts. One is our ability to be aware of danger, and the other is our wish to preserve ourselves. And this tension between our urge to live and our awareness that we're not gonna live leads to terror. And we then become aware we cannot live. And what we do is we act to preserve our identity and preserve our self-esteem by creating symbolic meaning from our lives that will transcend our mortality. through two ways. First, through alliances with larger identities, national, community, and a sort of cosmic senses of connection, and through legacies and other ways of transcending ourselves, and through beliefs like in religion and the afterlife and our superiority as beings. And this is connected to another idea, which is mortality salience theory, which is really interesting in terms of understanding our climate actions and also how we behaved during COVID. What it says is that increased awareness of your death will lead to behaviors not to protect your health, but to behaviors that will increase your self-esteem or restore your core identity and make you feel invulnerable. So if you ask yourself, what did you do during COVID? Did you do more actually healthy behaviors, or did you do things that helped you to preserve your sense of yourself? Okay. I personally did a lot of things to preserve my sense of self, including taking one huge COVID risk to be part with a group of people that were a really core part of who I was. And so you can understand things like the political tribalism, the anti-vax movement, things like skin tanning salons, as things that people are doing that, even though they lower their chances of survival, increase your odds of preserving your core identity. And it's a really interesting way to think about some of the weird things that go on in society. And then finally, Gifford's last group of reasons that we resist climate action has to do with the worldviews that work against it. Most of these can be seen as a kind of manic defense against a more sad and limited reality. Okay? At the top of the list is free market capitalism, which is the most anti-climate worldview of all. It assumes inequality, and it assumes endless plunder and spew, treating nature as what has been called a breast and diaper mother, meaning that we use the resources up as the breast and the diaper is where we put our waste. And I think as psychiatrists, we need to think about the fact that this is a world view that we make our privileged living off of. So we have to question how we are involved in it. And how would we feel if the market were really to change and reward people who produce food or protect animals more than it rewards us? And grappling with that feeling can be important. This tendency to want the system to keep working when it works for us is called system justification. It's a resistance to climate action. And we can also resist climate action by thinking of it as God's plan or the work of Mother Nature, or hoping what's called techno-salvation, that technology will fix everything. Many have said that American values are fundamentally anti-climate. We're a country that values speed, change, competition, action and work, practicality, efficiency, and materialism, controlling and extracting from the environment. And these are not the priorities of people who are thinking about cooperation, preserving tradition, the well-being of the group, or larger, more idealized values that you see in other cultures. So here's another clinical exercise. A narcissistic entrepreneur is full of manic triumph as he purchases another oil field while divorcing his fourth wife and alienating his 3 children who like to ski. He complains bitterly about the lack of appreciation and the hostility of the local indigenous tribe for whom he's building a heritage museum as a gift for the purchase he's making. How might you help him empathize with and communicate with the members of these groups? How might you slowly shift his values and priorities while also preserving his self-esteem? So these are the kinds of dynamic questions that I think we sort of have to start asking ourselves, because it makes it obvious that you have to bring in things that are outside of a usual focus of the patient's concern. Right? And it involves creating an awareness of something larger than what we usually think of being part of the treatment. So I just introduced that. Yeah. Okay, so we've talked about it's hard to get people to know about climate change, and it's hard to get them to think and believe about climate change because of resistances. But even if we were to assume that all of that were going just fine, what are some of the additional ways that thinking and feeling about climate change is so hard? First of all, climate change is overwhelming, and just completely overwhelmingly overwhelming. It's been called a hyperobject, a term which is defined as something so large and complex and dispersing of cause and effect as to be unknowable. Okay? It's been called a wicked problem, which it certainly is, which means that when you fix one part of the problem, another part of the problem gets thrown off, right? And that you can't ever get it quite right, and that you can only have better and worse outcomes. And how you think about the problem influences what the solution to the problem is. So it's a wicked problem in that way. And it's therefore a perfect storm for moral and political controversy. It's not complicated. It's not a complicated system like a watch, which, although it has many parts, is linear and predictable in how it works. It's complex. And complex systems are really interesting. Complex systems are those that involve multiple dynamic elements, interact with many different behavioral patterns in ways that are nonlinear, that are layered. Complex systems contain feedback loops. They're open to outside influences. The parts of the system are not in equilibrium with each other, so you can't influence them equally. The elements of a complex systems, as humans are in relationship to distant climate forces, are ignorant of the total behavior of the system in which they are embedded. And while they have systems, memory, and history, they are chaotic in the sense that they formally follow chaos theory. But they have several sort of positive qualities, which are emergence, the butterfly effect, and following evolutionary or generational time, which gives hope for interesting things emerging from them. All right, so we'll turn now to the emotion.
What do you mean by emergence and the other word, existential time? Could you tell us what that means? Yeah.
Evolutionary time. Oops, sorry, I got to go back.
Yeah.
Evolutionary time means generational time, so they follow a different time frame than we're used to, and things evolve in different ways. So even if we see temporary evolution that we don't like, we can be aware that there are also larger processes going on. Emergence just refers to the property of new things emerging out of chaos, right? Unpredictable things, but things that are new and creative.
Okay. That's, yeah.
All right, so those are all the ways that it's hard. We're now going to get into how it's hard emotionally.
Yeah.
Emotionally, climate change is profoundly threatening. And the best description of psychodynamics of this threat was written over a decade ago by Sally Weintraub, who's a British psychoanalyst who's done a lot of work in this area. And I'm just going to read a condensation of what she wrote because it's just beautiful. It's difficult to admit fully to consciousness the nonverbal and invisible, all-encompassing nature of the external world we inhabit. When we allow ourselves to see our abject dependence on it, on air, on water, we experience fear of annihilation at the most primitive level. It threatens our narcissism, that part of ourselves that wants to survive, generate offspring, and ensure continuity. It fundamentally splits our outer reality into something that threatens survival and provides for our basic needs. It fundamentally splits our basic trust in the natural world and in other humans as alternatively life-giving and life-threatening. We're caught up in a cycle of terror about climate change, that we face psychological destruction if we allow full awareness of it, and literal destruction if we don't. Denial and disavowal are our defenses, awareness without impact. We oscillate between obsession, delusion, despair, wishful thinking, abstraction, and intellectualization, fatalism, hysteria, moral masochism, and moral superiority. And with enough support, grief, and reparative autonomous action. So I think that's just a really beautiful description of what the things are that go into difficult climate emotions. According to Paul Tillich, the theologian philosopher who wrote The Courage to Be in 1952, the three core types of existential anxiety are anxiety from fear of annihilation, anxiety from a meaningless life, and anxiety about having failed to live up to your own moral code. It's interesting because Tillich's life was shaped by the death of his mother when he was 17, and by his service in the trenches of World War II, where he lost many best friends. And interestingly, he had an open marriage. And it's, I think, important to think about this as a model for the kinds of ways that traumatic experiences lead to growth mindsets and a willingness to try something new in terms of existential crises. Climate distress can present in a lot of ways. Many people will become aware of climate impacts through natural disaster, through grief as they watch the loss of wildlife and nature, through rage, betrayal, and victimization as political leaders act dismissively. Relationally, it may present as late teens and college students act out destructive hedonism or nihilism, young couples conflicted over whether to have children, longer relationships becoming estranged due to different levels of climate concern. In an individual patient, associated presentations are quite common, whether expressed as anxiety due to disavowal or the unconscious awareness of the destructiveness of their lifestyle, shame and guilt as that discordance becomes more conscious, or other kinds of feelings. So there are many, many faces of climate distress. And we can maybe just simplify these into 6 core emotions: patients feeling scared, lost, guilty, angry, uncaring, or heartbroken, and dissociated and overwhelmed in the face of all of them.
Mhm.
So that brings us to our next question. If dissociation and feeling overwhelmed from the demands of climate change is the core of the therapy problem, what can be done therapeutically to decrease dissociation and mobilize our climate emotions into meaningful action? Yeah. And in truth, psychodynamic orientations actually don't lend themselves very easily to climate change. It's not a particularly action-oriented form of treatment, quite the opposite. It tends to be highly centered on the person's individual private life and not to bring in outside things like nature relatedness or social concerns unless the patient is focused on them. And because of this, we actually do recommend a bit of a shift in stance to be open to new therapeutic frameworks, including those from lay organizations, to be much more open than usual with the patient about being in the same boat with them, even if that takes away some of your safety and authority for them, because this allows for the kind of twinning and idealizing transferences that can emerge as they lean on your strength in confronting this challenge. You do have to bring in ideas from the outside as well as emotions from inside and integrate the two. And we feel it's really important to keep the focus on loss and uncertainty and overwhelm, as we actually really believe that, and many people do, many different approaches to this, that within these traumatic emotions actually lies the best hope for creative growth and change. You have many roles available to you to affect climate action. You can act as a citizen, public health officer, mental health expert, and activist, in addition to therapist. In all of these roles, a psychodynamic understanding can be helpful in terms of tact, timing, and dosage of what should be said, in terms of the conditions for psychic safety, in terms of the unconscious messages that may inadvertently be communicated through messages and backfire, and to help patients tolerate really powerful affects. There are several schools of working with climate distress. There are 2 that I have not shown here. These include climate-aware climate cafes, which are sort of group cafe processes based on death cafes, which cultivate awareness of death to help people be engaged, to gather in a supportive space and share thoughts and feelings about climate change. And then there's the work of a Buddhist teacher, Joanna Macy, and her colleagues, which is called The Work That Reconnects. It draws on deep ecology and indigenous and Buddhist traditions. And it's a 4-stage process that takes you through very embedded, embodied, nature-based practices through steps of grief for the world, gratitude, seeing with new eyes, and going forth. And in the Work That Reconnects, there actually are 60 group processes that people can engage in to work more deeply with nature. But I've put 3 processes that are more therapeutic here. The first is called deep adaptation. It was developed by Jim Bendell, who's a professor of economics, and working with other scientists. They all came to appreciate how close to climate collapse we are, and they feel very alienated in their work. And so it starts with really grounding yourself in the inevitability of climate collapse and what it will mean. And then you ask yourself the 4 R's. Given that my world will collapse, what do I want to relinquish so as not to make it worse? What do I want to keep through resilience? What do I want to reconcile with as my losses mount? And what can I restore from older practices to help with this new time? So that's the deep adaptation model. It's a group therapy model. The second is the Good Grief Network. This is a kind of American 12-step program, sort of like AA. It starts also with the acceptance of the severity and the uncertainty of the problem. And it focuses on honoring how all things will die, including the practitioner, and honoring one's own contribution to the losses. And then it attempts to be with that and work through those losses and one's participation in it. And people are asked to show up, question your biases, practice connection, witnessing, and gratitude, and take fun breaks together. And then the Climate Aware Therapy Program is a new program under development by the members of the Climate Psychology Alliance and Climate Psychiatry Alliance. And this is a short training for therapists interested in teaching interested in the area that teaches techniques we think are important. These include, first and foremost, validating patients' climate distress, which runs up against a social and political reality continually, as well as runs up against the patient's own wish to invalidate themselves through various forms of escape. It's also important to help the patient stay grounded and that the therapy provide forms of containment for the size and complexity of the problem. We've used this idea we call the metaphor of the baby to emphasize that we're all coming at this in a brand new and rapidly changing way, sort of like an infant, kind of fresh and alert and ready to grow, ready to learn, but not expected to know and not expected to solve things all by ourselves. That sort of helps people with their tremendous sense of responsibility and guilt. Be in the same boat as the patient, cultivate community, and cultivate time in and connection to nature. And then there's meaning-based coping, which is found to be helpful with climate anxiety, which is, if you know anything about acceptance and commitment therapy, is very similar. It's identifying your core values and acting from that place. And then finally, this idea of climate dialectics, which we wrote a little bit about, which I'll talk about in a second. So the core aspects of these programs are sitting deeply with the collapse and loss, working on a secure attachment to nature, taking non-hierarchical views of the therapist and the human relationship to nature, creativity, emergence, and change, and the cultivation of community. Countertransferences can be really important in this work. You have to be sure to allow yourself to experience the full alarm of the situation and metabolize it on your own, so you don't suppress it or project it in some awkward moment of the patient when they bring up frightening material, and so you don't deny or invalidate the patient. You must struggle with the confusion of your own complicity in this. If you don't grapple with it and the need to adapt the treatment frame and its boundaries to deal with this new reality, you won't really be responding to the situation. And we may also be in the position of receiving the patient's rage, either because we're older and they're a younger generation, or because we're a member of the elite, and we have to be ready for that if it's appropriate. This year, Susan Kassoff wrote a paper about a different way to be with the ability, a different way to cultivate the ability to be with collapse emotions. And she looks at the work of Bion and his writing about the tolerance for aggressive or negative, frustrating situations and how that leads to thinking. And what she advocates for is that we should practice catastrophic thinking about climate change to open up our ability to think about the parts that we wish to disavow. And she bases this on work with patients who are more open because they've been through trauma early in their lives and are able to sustain thought and action without dissociation in new traumatic situations that come to them. She calls them broken open by their traumas and more resilient, rather than having a tendency to idealize or dissociate from difficult situations by idealizing the past. I didn't say that very well. So there's lots of interesting ideas in there. We also have worked on this idea of dialectics. And what we found is that patients, when they're working on climate change, tend to be depleted and exhausted and kind of collapsed, maybe a little bit the way you're feeling right now. And this is often the case because they get stuck on one side of a climate dialectic and they can't see the other, right? So they might, for example, feel really bad because their attempts to take action on climate are going nowhere because they're all caught up in what we call the climate reality, right? But they haven't taken into account the social reality, which moves differently and moves slowly. And if you do that, then you'll sort of have new ideas about how to work with the need for climate action in terms of what the social reality can tolerate. They might also feel really bad because they're feeling hopeless. And if they look at exactly the same problem they're facing from a point of view of hope, they may suddenly discover that there's all sorts of great things going on that they can get involved in. And so by flipping these various dialectics around, it creates a space for sort of creative action and seems to get people out of feeling so exhausted. And there are many, many ways to help the patient contain their distress. Spiritual ways, rituals, rites of passage to move through change, narrative work, the patient using the therapist as a co-regulator of emotion, agentic ways, meaning empowering actions they can take, and cognitive processes. So there's lots that we can do. So lots of things that we can do in working with this. There is a final question, which is there's probably more. And in trying to work a little bit on this talk, I put together this slide, which I'm going to stop in a second, so I may have to go back to it. But there's various overlaps, which I think are really worthy of conversation and discussion tonight between the climate problems that we face and some of the psychodynamics equivalents. One has to do with the massive external unknowability, and the other has to do with the massive internal unknowability and the processes that we use to access them. So be very interested in your thoughts about that. But for now, I'll just show you this picture of me in Yosemite and then go back to that, and we can talk a little bit.